It is a great honor to be with the panel and with all of you today. Thank you. Thank you. So this theme of contemplation and action, yesterday during my remarks about Thomas Merton and his role in my own life, I alluded to music as having a key role, playing a key role in my childhood and on into my adult life. How music really for me was a kind of a first doorway into prayer and contemplation. And learning the piano as a child was really my first teacher in the way of prayer, of deep listening, and of contemplation. And so I thought it would be interesting to experiment and test that insight a little bit in our panel today by beginning with the story of two musicians, and then in just a moment listening together to a remarkable piece of music. So let me just provide a little bit of background for the music meditation that I'd like to invite us all into. And it begins with the story of Eugene Friesen, who is a cellist. And if you have the slides, I'd like to show you a picture. So Eugene Friesen is a wonderful cellist who played for many years in the Paul Winter Consort. Many of you will know Paul Winter as a pioneer in jazz and world music and fusion. And his friend Paul Haley, who's a piano player, and together Eugene Friesen and Paul Haley played in the Paul Winter Consort for many years, but they had never recorded together, just the two of them, and always wanted to. And so one night in the deep winter of 1986, somehow they arranged to set up their instruments in St. John's Cathedral of the Divine in New York City. I think the largest Baroque cathedral in the world, just a magnificent space. And in the middle of the night, in the winter, they set up their instruments. If you can picture this in almost total darkness, and they had only one person with them who was a recording engineer. And that night, they played together and recorded everything that they played. And the result of that evening is an album called New Friend, a remarkable recording, unlike anything I've heard before or since. The final song that they recorded is called Full Circle, and that's the song I want to share with you as a kind of a doorway into our topic. But I want to ask you to imagine yourself with me, being there, being present, maybe sitting up in the choir loft looking down on these two musicians with just a little bit of light, a little bit of light on their instruments, enough so that they could see each other and respond to each other. And so we'll have a moment of silence, and then I'll ask to cue music. Before we start the music, one other detail that I want to share, that everything that they recorded that night was unrehearsed. They hadn't rehearsed any of the music, so it all was improvised. It sprang, as it were, from nothing, from the womb, if you will, of this silent cathedral. So let's pause for about 15 seconds, and then when you guys are ready up there, after a moment of silence, please cue the music. seems ashamed to speak into the silence after that, but if I were to ask you one word or a phrase to describe that piece of music, anybody? Pardon? Exalted. Pardon? Joyful. Together, magical.
Alive.
Alive. Yeah. Any images come to mind?
Light, water,
Mm.
springtime, running through the field,
Yes.
brooks over rocks,
Brook over rocks, running through a field. Spiral.
light, dancing.
Dancing, yeah. The image of the dance is an image that comes to me very much, and as the two musicians kind of, Eugene Friesen opens the space, and then Paul Haley comes in, and they're off, circling around each other, giving and taking and listening, responding. Just phenomenal piece of music. We could spend a half an hour, I'm sure, or an hour, just on this piece of music. I played this. I play it often in class, in my classes, and I'll never forget one time when I asked my students for their response. Immediately, this big burly baseball player sits in the back row. His hand shot up, and he said, "Professor Pramuk, that was a fucking miracle." I dismissed them all on the spot. I mean, there was nothing more to say. That was.
Baseball, that's spiritual profanity.
That's all right. And for the rest of the semester, that was our go-to term. Whenever we would, come up short for words, we just said, that's AFM, So, and why not? I mean, there's more than a hint of the miraculous, what I might call the possibilities of presence, when we're really present to one another, like these two musicians, alive, present to self, present to other, present to the earth, present to God, the divine presence who beckons and holds each of us each moment into our being. I'm going to walk over and get the clicker so I can show you just a couple other slides. So, again, we could tease out so many different wonderful themes out of just this piece of music alone, but just to gesture to some of the paradoxes, that come together in one piece of music. How about solitude and communion? Imagine these two musicians their whole life long mastering their instrument in many, many hours of solitude, so that they didn't have to think about their instruments anymore. The technical mastery is just phenomenal, and they can forget about it. So that when they come together to play, they can be completely free to respond to each other in that moment. And look what is born out of that. Solitude and communion, all of it there in this spectacular piece of music. How about the paradox of structure and freedom? The discipline it takes to master an instrument, the structure, the scales, all the rest of it, which is a miserable thing. If you've ever learned an instrument, it's very difficult to master scales and all the rest. But that structure and that, and the music is not chaotic. It's not anarchic, right? There's a structure to it. And yet, like good choreography, the structure sets free the two musicians. It gives them freedom within which a kind of a structure to make beautiful music. So we could play with a lot of paradoxes. Emptiness. Imagine the emptiness of the cathedral and how out of that womb of emptiness comes this fullness of vitality and life. Receiving and responding. I think you see where I'm going with this as a metaphor for the spiritual life and for the sort of seeming dichotomy of contemplation and action, which really are two sides of one beautiful dance in the spiritual life. I want to mention one other thing, that this could have failed, that there was risk, there was vulnerability. They had not rehearsed this music. They didn't know what would happen. And yet, in vulnerability and trust, they brought themselves to the dance and trusted that something good and beautiful might emerge. But it could have failed. And again, isn't that how it is in the spiritual life? To endure the moments of dryness, the rigidity of formal prayer, liturgy, all the rest sometimes, which is very unsatisfying, and yet we show up, trusting that something will emerge, that the power of presence will fill us again. So let me shift then into our world today, and I want to share an example from the life of Thomas Merton by way of illustration. I grant that when we look at the state of our world today, the sheer scope of violence and division, the musical metaphor might seem a little quaint, romantic even, at best, or even naive and Pollyannish at worst. When you compare it to kind of the need to get into the public fray of political discourse and action, revolutionary action for change and for justice. But I want to gesture to one concrete example of what I'm trying to suggest here about the miraculous possibilities of presence. A kind of beautifully improvised music, if you will, unexpected, that emerges in the life of Thomas Merton in the last decade, especially in his outreach to people of other faiths, and especially in his role as pastor to the peace movement. Just to gesture to this remarkable gathering in 1964 at Gethsemane, when Merton hosted 14 peace activists, including the Berrigan brothers, Jim Forrest, Tom Cornell, John Howard Yoder, A.J. Musty, and many others, names that are probably familiar to many of you. They ranged from ages 23 to 79, representing Catholic, mainline Protestant, Quaker, and Unitarian traditions. And over the course of 3 days of intense conversation and prayer, they touched on topics ranging from the nuclear threat to racial justice, poverty, the increasing invasion of technology and media into our lives. They prayed together. They drank some beer together, no doubt smuggled into Merton's hermitage by some mad farmer who he knew down the road. They probably drank some bourbon together. There's a wonderful new book by Gordon Oyer about this conference called Pursuing the Spiritual Roots of Protest. Why did they come? In an era of sharply divided religious and political camps, what motivated Merton and these others to come together in a remote monastery in the middle of Kentucky to explore what they called the spiritual roots of protest? Perhaps the same thing that compels us here together in Louisville 50 years later, to rediscover ourselves, our deep kinship in one another and in the mystery of God. Think about it, like Eugene Friesen and Paul Haley, they came to make something beautiful seemingly out of nothing. There was risk, there was vulnerability. There was no score written ahead of time, no playbook for such an ecumenical gathering in 1964. It would be very hard to overstate how radical this meeting was at this time in the United States. Not a few Catholics in my own tradition, and probably even a few of Merton's fellow monks would have considered it scandalous, actually, that he was meeting across boundaries outside the Catholic tradition. From the vantage point of historical perspective, we might even call it AFM. That was my laugh line, so thank you for getting it. But truly, it really is an astonishing meeting. And so I urge you to find that book of Gordon Oyers. Just a couple of things about what they did, and then I'll sit down. One of the key questions they wrestled with, really the first one that framed their agenda, was this question: by what right do we protest? By what right do we protest? And I think behind the question lay the conviction that protest by itself, without spiritual roots, without presence, without discipline of silence and listening to the other, perhaps listening to our enemy, the one who we want to throttle because they have their boot on our neck, that protest and revolutionary action without some measure of humility, without a sense of mutuality, without love, dare I say it, can very easily devolve into the same kind of mass injustice practiced by the state or perpetuated on the powerless by those in power. And on this point, their discussions were overshadowed, haunted everywhere by Reinhold Niebuhr, the great American Protestant theologian, whose writings on public theology, if you will, theology in the public square, emphasized over and over again how human beings, especially in groups, have an amazing capacity for self-deception, a tendency to self-justify, to rationalize our own position, and finally to demonize the other. What he described as the moral seduction of the collective, the mob, the herd, to demonize and to seize power. And of course, he pointed out, and Merton says this all over the place, religious groups are no exception. In one of Merton's greatest essays, Rain in the Rhinoceros, he refers to this condition, this tendency to run in herds and to trample everything in our path. He calls it rhinoceritis. You know, using this image of humanity, modern humanity, as a kind of a rhinoceros. And so, to conclude, what is contemplation? Why solitude? Why come into the woods to meet? Or why gather in meetings like this to talk to each other? Contemplation calls us back to the difficult work of self-understanding, of integrity, to rediscover our deepest capacity to love, to listen. It is a check on the ego and the ego's obsessiveness, aggressiveness, the need to be right. Merton says we've made a fetish out of action, and we seem to have lost the ability to pray, to reflect, to contemplate. And so, in a word, we're trying to recover our humanity in the Spirit of God, centered in the Spirit, so that when we come back into the public square, we can do so from a spirit of fellowship, of kinship, and love for humanity, and so that we don't carry back into the public square the seeds of violence and of aggressiveness. Yes, we need to speak truth to power, but from as much as possible to do it from a spirit of love and of compassion and solidarity. Here is the hidden music, I think, of Merton's role as pastor to the peace movement, and I'll end with this quote. You see the picture here with Dan Berrigan and others just out in the woods in front of his hermitage. He says this, and I think it's a beautiful quote for our gathering this week. Simply, we want to be present to each other, and then trust what happens. Presence is what counts. Community is presence, not an institution. Thank you.
That's great.